Well, how are you all? Welcome to the latest lecture on African political thought. As I'm lecturing, it's Sunday late morning and my part of London is being covered in snow. So it's a very, very lovely foreground, which I can see beyond my computer screen. I hope you're all keeping well. I hope that all of you are taking the normal precautions that we need to take at this point in time. And indeed, the news from my front is that by the time I actually meet you all on Thursday night, I should have had, all being smooth, I should have had my COVID injection. And this means one of the virtues of being somewhat older than most other people kicks in. But by virtue of being older, what it means is that I can actually remember a very great deal of the things that we're discussing today. 1966, for instance, was the Cultural Revolution in China. And although I was a young person at that point in time, still coming to the end of my high school years, the tumult in China was something that seemed quite astounding. Obviously, for those who were victimized at that point in time in China, it was astounding in a very negative fashion. But one of my first jobs many years later in the 1980s in British academia was at Oxford when, after many years of rural re-education, many of the Red Guards, that is, the young shock troops used in a very cynical fashion, I think, by Chairman Mao, were finally released from their rural, well, let us say, isolation, captivity, and allowed years afterwards to get on with their education. So some of them were able to come to Oxford on a special program, and I was meant to be their pastoral advisor as well as tutor. And their stories were very harrowing because it was an attempt to change the entire cultural fabric of China. It was, in Chairman Mao's own terms, an effort to create the new Chinese man, although, of course, both young men and young women were dragooned into the Red Guards, basically indoctrinated in the sayings of the so-called Little Red Book, which they used to wave around almost like a visual mantra, and basically spout words of wisdom about taking forward the new Chinese personality in the face of all challenges, in the face of the antique past of China, and in the face of encroachment and threat from the external world, particularly the Western world. In other words, it was an effort once and for all on the part of Chairman Mao to refabricate the Chinese personality so that it was aloof and independent from external influences and from the influences of one's own past, and go forward in a renewed fashion, in the fashion of what had been a compulsory renaissance to greet the future and all of the challenges, both internal and external. So the past was wiped out, literally. If you think about the Chinese habit of, in your living room, surrounding the edges of the ceiling with wooden plaques, each one devoted to an ancestor, until literally you could have had wooden plaques that represented hundreds and hundreds of years, if not thousands of years, of ancestry. They were all wiped away as part of the program of renewal. And so many, many ancestral records, much history was lost. Okay, now I labor this because that was 1966. And it was about the same time as African leaders of recently independent countries were also themselves contemplating not only how to run their new states, but the kind of new African personality that should inhabit these states. The idea of what was then still called the new man, it was something which was an international preoccupation, particularly on the part of those countries that wished to be free of Western shackles, colonial shackles, an imperialized past. But of course, what this meant was if you were going to be a new personality, how much of the old history were you going to wipe away? What kind of future were you going to embrace? And what could you select from history that in any case made you profoundly African and which equipped you with the best, perhaps the edited best of the past, to go forward into the future? Now, a very great deal was contemplated in a very, very short period of time. And the idea of creating the new African personality went side by side, as I said, with trying to create a new state, often a state starting from the position of a deficit. In other words, not enough public administrative apparatus. I've said this about Kenneth Kaunda's Zambia, not enough income to do all of the things that one aspired to do, not enough income even to overturn, on a substantial basis, the legacies of the colonial past. Try to live with the past while trying to go forward, while trying to raise the income with which to go forward, to bring the fruits of development, hence the fruits of modernity, to a new country without a proper, as yet, state apparatus, meant a very great deal of concentration of power in a very narrow range of people, usually around the presidency. If the president was one of the few very well-educated people or thoughtful people, all the same influenced by international currents of thought, but wanting very much to create something new, not only for all of the citizens of the new country, but something new in terms of the citizens of the new country. What you had was a recipe of great ambition, but also a recipe that was going to be highly infused with the perils of dislocation. And we'll see that in the experiences that we'll be discussing today. Kwame Nkrumah, who became the first leader of independent Ghana, formal independence came in 1957, but in fact he was already Prime Minister of self-government in Ghana as early as 1952. The British gave in to agitation that he led, the kind of agitation that was possible in an urbanized society. It was more urbanized than many other African societies. It was a society where mounting strikes was possible, where shutting down institutions was possible because there were institutions, where there was a sufficiently educated class to mobilize behind Nkrumah and to understand what he was trying to say. This is not to say they wanted to do what he said, but they understood what he was trying to say, particularly in the face of the British. So this kind of agitation led to self-government quite early on. In other words, when you think of Britain emerging from World War II in 1945, this is only 7 years later when self-government was given to Ghana. And this was, as I said, the result of much agitation conducted in the urban areas, but also the result of much thought on the part of Nkrumah. He had been greatly influenced at the 1945 Manchester Conference, the Congress, the Pan-African Congress, by the Caribbean thinker George Padmore. But even before then, in terms of his education within Ghana itself, he had been exposed to lectures by Azikiwe, who went on to become the first president of Nigeria. In some ways, one of the great undersung independence presidents, because shortly after Nigeria became independent, it was plunged into turmoil and civil war. But Azikiwe was a first-class intellectual who not only influenced Nkrumah when he was a young student in Ghana, but also went before him to America to study at what is now known as Lincoln University, a university which was a black-only university. It was founded in the days when this kind of institution was the only kind of higher education institution available to most black people. Some black students broke through. Webb Du Bois, for instance, as I said, attained a PhD at Harvard, the first black person to do so. But for the bulk of black students in America, it was pretty much going to universities that had been set up especially for a black student body. And Lincoln University had a history in which it had been involved with the American Colonial Society, which was basically the intellectual animation for the return of black people to Liberia, for instance. So people like Blyden was greatly influenced by this kind of education which harked to a homeland. It was a homeland, of course, which had to be colonized in the light of the educational values that was imparted by institutions like Lincoln, but all the same was a beacon of hope within the United States as to the possibilities of higher education for young black people. So Nkrumah basically wanted to go to America, wanted to learn from the black American experience, had no real choice when he got there but to study, in the first instance at least, at black universities like Lincoln, where he took 2 degrees. He found that Ezekiel had been there before him, and indeed one of the major halls of residence in Lincoln University today is named after the 2 of them. So that the influence that they brought was recognized afterwards. The influences they gained while they were there were quite profound, because of course Lincoln is near Pennsylvania. It was an urban center, large black population. It was a center in which intellectual discussion was possible, and many influences ran through Pennsylvania in a very, very profound way. Later on, after he graduated with 2 degrees from Lincoln, Nkrumah was able to take 2 master's degrees at the University of Pennsylvania. Basically, he had to prove himself first at Lincoln before he could gain admission to Pennsylvania. But in this way, he became a highly educated person. And although he began a PhD here in London, he never completed that. He was already by that stage setting his sights on going back, leading unrest and agitation for independence. As I said, self-government came first, and then finally independence in 1957, the first of a swathe of independences that followed from 1960 onwards. So he led the way in many, many respects, but his ambition to do things in a hurry meant all kinds of difficulties because he did not have much education in government, how to run governments. He did not have much education in public administration. He did not really understand mining, which was a key income earner for Ghana, and he certainly did not understand cocoa farming, which is one of the key agricultural products of Ghana. He understood modernity having been exposed to it. He understood denigration by having been exposed to it not only in his colonial history, but also by being a working black student in the kitchens of restaurants and cafes while he was earning his way through his degree. And he was very, very conscious of the need to rise above what all of these things symbolized, what all of these things meant. And he wanted to do it in a hurry while developing his country in a hurry. To a certain extent, the economic problems of Ghana that lasted for decades after him were due to his rush to do things without adequate financing or adequate economic strategy. In other words, the key ingredients in terms of national planning were not yet in place, and the conviction that he could basically think it all through himself led to all kinds of difficulties. But he also wanted the new African man. And he put forward the idea of this in a philosophical treatise, which he called Conscientism. Now, this came at a time when the state building experiment was not going well. When you look at the 3 countries that we're going to have some thoughts on today, Ghana, Tanzania, and Zambia, well, we had Ghana gaining full independence in 57, Tanzania 61, and you had Zambia gaining independence in 1964. But they became one-party states, Ghana in 1964, Tanzania in 1962, just 1 year after independence, and what you had was a one-party state in Zambia in 1967. The leaders of all of these three countries pleading exigency and the need to overcome emergency conditions. Some of these were externally caused, as in the case of Zambia, by the unilateral declaration of white settlers in southern Rhodesia, putting an economic lock on the old northern Rhodesia, Zambia. Some of it was to do with the failure, or already the perceived difficulties of trying to build a new state in countries without adequate economic planning. So you had the need to basically conscript the citizenry to the national project. You actually had to have a philosophy to make them buy in to something which was deemed necessary, and you had to have a coercive apparatus, or at least an apparatus that diminished opposition. Therefore, underneath a one-party state, opposition parties, of course, were not allowed. And of course, the president of the state also was the president of the government, also was the president of the party. So the concentration of authority and power in the person of one leader was something which again followed the Chinese model to a certain extent. It followed the North Korean model led by Kim Il-sung, the grandfather of today's North Korean leader. There's a family dynasty there. And his philosophy of juche, self-reliance. The Chinese had their Cultural Revolution. The Africans were also going to have their revolution of the new African personality based on what they thought was an intellectual apparatus. Some of this was the result, in Ghana's case, of Nkrumah's exposure to Black African thought. He appreciated what Webb Du Bois was saying. He was greatly influenced by Marcus Garvey. He was influenced by the cultural expressionism of what they call the Harlem Renaissance in New York, where the arts took on a new vibrancy, a new creative vibrancy, which demonstrated what an African personality could do. But the intellectual influences were people like Webb Du Bois and people like Marcus Garvey. And the idea that Garvey imparted to Nkrumah was of Pan-Africanism. And indeed, as I said, the Manchester Congress was one called the Pan-African Congress. So you had actually three strands, trying to build a new state out of a low base, trying in the end coercively to build the new African personality so that the new African personality could help to build a new state, and trying to build a Pan-Africa when Pan-Africa was not only an almost impossible dream in terms of the logistics of doing it, but was still at the same time just coming out of its colonial era and coming out of different forms of colonialism, and with certain metropolitan powers, Portugal, for instance, remaining stubborn, pockets of white resistance, as in southern Rhodesia, and very heavily militarized so in apartheid South Africa. So the dream of a Pan-Africa was difficult, but all the same was a background vision. It led to the formation of the Organization of African Unity, in which Nkrumah was a prime mover. But at the same time, it had to be a background to the struggles to build a state. And when difficulties began to set in, because basically of maladministration and lack of economic planning, trying almost coercively through one-party apparatus to build the new African citizen, the new African personality, the new African man, which all the same spoke to an international current, which is apparent in China and in North Korea. So the range of ambitions, one has to appreciate it wasn't just something within Africa. It was something which spoke to a wider phenomenon, but it had peculiar African reference points. In terms of what Nkrumah was trying to do. He basically had in his conscientism a 9-point program. And I'm going to run through these for you. The first one is what is important is the thought rather than its written articulation. Now, this is dangerous, but it also excuses Nkrumah because a lot of his own written thought is contradictory, or at least so hopelessly aspirational that it's difficult to make sense of it in terms of its real application. Even after he was overthrown and he kept writing in exile, largely by that stage, all kinds of laws of Marxist history writings. And I had a discussion with his son at one point in time. The son, because Nkrumah was a very unpopular figure by the time of his overthrow, the son was taking a form of voluntary exile in Zimbabwe. We met there, and I asked him about the often bizarre writings of the later Nkrumah. And the son, who was himself something of an intellectual figure, did one of those shrugs of shoulders and rolling of eyes, which basically said, well, the old man type of thing, without finding the words to say anything negative about the father. But they were indeed, let us say, politely enigmatic writings, aspirational writings that preceded this. But what was more important was the thought rather than its written application. That got him off the hook in quite a number of ways. But it meant that he was able to say that in Africa there's a traditional way of life, there's an Islamic tradition, and there's a Christian and Western tradition. Okay, now in this it was not unlike the early writings of Blyden about Africa, the Negro race as he called it, Christianity and Islam. Those three things were there to stay, but what could one do to make a fusion, a hybrid, a developmental hybrid of all of them? Well, you had to take out certain ideals and basically say that this was traditional African ways of doing things. So the third point in the 9-point program was that there was a traditional way of life in which there were no sectional interests. Sectional interests came with colonialism. Well, this is actually not true. What you had, for instance, in the Ashanti culture was a kingship state with a hierarchical form of social organization in which, underneath a form of feudal governance, sectional interests were deeply embedded in this kind of kingship rule. However, to deny this was to lay the foundations for a more equal society underneath Nkrumah's vision of modernity and equality. So that his fourth point was that true independence required a new harmony that could forge tradition, Islam, and Christianity into a humanist ideology. They all tended to use this term humanism. Kaunda writ it large, but it kept cropping up in everybody's programs of thoughtful action. It had to be a harmony that spoke to the depths of African thought and culture, to African consciousness. Therefore, the name of his thinking was called conscientism, and would be the springboard for development. A new African personality would drive development in the new African state. But being willing was not all that was required, as I've already said. How to do it? Well, the restoration of a proper development underneath egalitarian, non-sectional interests had to require socialism. Sixth point was it had to be a socialism responsive to African conditions. But if you're going to have a socialism without production because of poor economic planning, how are you going to do it? The seventh point was that conscientism in its philosophical form must also fit the African personality. But what is meant by the African personality? You start to have a circular argument in which the African personality informs the philosophy and the philosophy informs the personality. So you can have a self-serving mode of thought which becomes self-fulfilling. It's aspirational, it's wonderful, it puts much faith in an African self-consciousness without actually defining it. And even great thinkers like Mudumbe, not a Ghanaian, Congolese in his origin, basically said that African gnosis, or hidden African knowledge, hidden in culture and in one's own deep pre-self-consciousness, that is yet to be fully discovered, fully articulated. It's there, according to Mudumbe, but how you bring it out is not necessarily done by political coerciveness, and certainly not necessarily by a one-party state. So number 8 in Nkrumah's 9-point program, the cardinal ethic of conscientism is to treat each man as an end and not as a means. That's well said. And the enemies of this ethic, point 9, are colonialism, imperialism, disunity, and lack of development. And as I said, all of these things are problematic because you're trying to incorporate certain elements that you've inherited from colonialism. And basically, in terms of guaranteeing development, you've got to know what it is that you are doing. The currency, the value of it plummeted. Discontent because of the lack of fulfillment of the fruits that were promised at independence began to grow. Because it grew in a reasonably well-developed society in terms of its urban, as it were, centers of organization, and because there were trained economists with ideas as to how to go forward, and because there was a more developed military than in many other countries, it wasn't long before a combination of all of these forces overthrew Nkrumah. That he goes down as a heroic figure cannot be gainsaid because of what he tried to do. It was so ambitious and idealistic, and so convinced that an African new personality could not only develop Africa, but could also take its place in the world as an equal. And this sense of equality internationally was a great driving force. And it's probably one of the great driving forces behind the idea of the Organization of African Unity and the idea of an ultimate Pan-Africa, an idea which is still aspirational and which is still not at a time when it's able to materialize. If this was the aspiration and also the downfall of Nkrumah, what you also had was something similar in Tanzania. Now, Nyerere had come to Great Britain, to Scotland. He had gained his degree at Edinburgh underneath the Scottish system. The first degree is called a master's degree. It looked very, very good, very much like the Oxford master's degree in the days of old. And it lent the patina of higher education. Now, in fact, he was a man who was multicultural. He was adopted by the Presbyterian faithful in Edinburgh. Again, he was the beneficiary of much support from the moderate left in Scotland. And he was also a great favorite in terms of the cultural left because he was a great aficionado of Shakespeare. And indeed, he translated Shakespeare's plays, not all of them, but some of them, into Swahili. One of the probably most successful of his translations was Julius Caesar. Another one of his translations of note was The Merchant of Venice, and the translation into Swahili meant a choice of term. How are you going to translate merchant? And the term that Nyerere chose probably is more accurately translated as the bourgeoisie of Venice. And you can already see the influence of ideas of class formation and class structure gained from a European source already influencing him, and as a background influence in his ideas of an eventual African socialism. But one of the ironic things about Julius Caesar was, of course, what you have in Julius Caesar is the idealistic of Rome, who is basically overthrown by his own personal aggrandizement. He thinks he can and should do it all by himself. and those who believe in a more egalitarian republic are those who overthrow him. It's almost as if he translated a warning for himself. Now, Nyerere was not overthrown. He actually stepped down and lived to a vibrant old age as an influence behind the scenes. He maintained his vibrancy even in his final days. I only met him once, and that was in an airport lounge, I think in Addis Ababa, where he was still extremely vibrant, even on his walking stick. By that stage, no longer president, but still exuding intellectual acuity. What he brought to Tanzania was a sense of Pan-Africanism, certainly. He wanted to do this one stage at a time. Therefore, the union of Tanganyika with Zanzibar, thus making modern Tanzania, took place underneath his watch. What it also brought, of course, was a deep Islamic influence, so that what you had in Zanzibar was indeed that kind of deep influence. And what you also had, of course, was the inevitability of a union of this sort, despite different peoples inhabiting the mainland and the island. And that is, of course, the common language of Swahili. There are more than just Swahili as languages in Tanzania, but Swahili is like a lingua franca. And the first written form of Swahili was using the Arabic alphabet. It's now written with a Latin alphabet. But what this meant was, particularly in terms of a literary history, you actually had one of the great canons of African poetry, Swahili poetry, recorded, written. And one can appreciate the literary skill and, of course, the intellectual and creative intellectual mindset that goes into writing poetry of this sort. It's there in black and white, unlike in many other jurisdictions that rely on oral recitation and memory to pass on the creative literature of many, many different cultures. In its Swahili form, certainly in its Arabic Swahili form, what you had was a legacy of history and culture. So that's no surprise that someone like Nyerere, in terms of his affection for great classical literature like Shakespeare, should also be drawn to the possibility of union, Tanganyika and Zanzibar, making, as it were, a living example of possible future Pan-African union, but also drawn to the idea of, okay, we can use Swahili as a lingua franca. It also speaks of the unity that is possible, but at the same time, you need to have other instruments to make it possible. And, like Nkrumah, set about trying to forge a philosophy, which again was heavily idealistic, and he was prepared to enforce, as it were, the creation of equality, or at least as much equality as possible. And he basically did this by a philosophy called Ujamaa, which was incorporated in what was called the Arusha Declaration. It was promulgated at Arusha, developed in later writings and declarations by Nyerere, and basically by the enforcement of a public administration code, which meant that there was a determination at equalization in terms of the economic conditions of Tanzanian life. Now, this was not possible in an absolute sense, but even when I would visit in the 1980s, working with one of the government ministries in Tanzania, what you had was per capita income in Tanzania, which at the highest level was only 6 times higher than at the base level, at the ground level, at the lowest level. Now, that's something quite profound in terms of its achievement. Of course, that didn't last. But what it did mean was, at one point in time, an effort at least, even if underneath one-party state conditions, to try to pull together. Now, there were some problems with this, because underneath Ujamaa, not unlike underneath Juche in North Korea, self-reliance, there was an effort to pool together in terms of the communalization of agricultural production. And not unlike the commune experience in China, where entire communities were dragooned together away from their traditional villages into new communes, where they had to achieve a local identity and partake in joint collective labor for the benefit of all. Nyerere tried to do this with collectivization in Tanzania, which meant that people were uprooted from their villages, often forced into new communal productive centers that might have looked good in terms of their distribution on the maps, but not always related to the best agricultural production in terms of land and soil, uprooted from the sites of their traditional practices, the graves of their ancestors, and therefore the spirits of their ancestors, into something which the world thought was a bit like Soviet collectivization, but probably was more drawn from the Chinese model. And of course, there was huge resistance, and because of a lack of expertise in terms of agricultural planning, and the supposition that you can plan national agriculture centrally, notwithstanding having different units of collective agricultural production under these different circumstances and different, as were soil and climate conditions in different parts of the country, it, like Soviet collectivization, was a great disaster. People believed internationally in this image. And it wasn't just the British who thought that Nyerere was a philosopher king. The Scandinavians poured so much money into the Tanzanian experience that years after the experiment failed, the only thing that kept the books balanced nationally was Scandinavian funding. Now that, of course, has now diminished considerably. But the idea of a social democracy and of collectivization was something which spoke to a certain form of European experience, a certain form of Chinese benefaction. So the Chinese always looked favorably upon Nyerere. And of course, Nyerere used Tanzania. He allowed Tanzania to be used as a training base for Zimbabwean guerrillas. This didn't mean that he was immune from raids from the White South. Even Dar es Salaam got bombed, but not nearly as often as Kenneth Kaunda's Lusaka, for instance. But what you had were Chinese advisors, soldiers, very much on Tanzanian soil, training the Zimbabwean guerrilla fighters of Robert Mugabe's wing of the liberation movement. All of the early tactics when they went home to Rhodesia were basically drawn from the Chinese experience, but the white Rhodesians were not fighting like the Chinese nationalists and the Japanese colonial forces in China. Their own strategy was adapted to the terrain upon which they fought. And it's probably true to say that unit after unit, certainly of the early guerrilla fighters, was sent out basically to see how many casualties Chinese tactics would incur, cannon fodder, for want of another word. So although there was much international solidarity, what you had were also many, many problems. So internationally, all the same, China was important. The Chinese tried to build a railway from Zambia through to Dar es Salaam to try to escape the economic stranglehold the white Rhodesians posed to Kenneth Kaunda. Cecil Rhodes, railways and roads went south through white territory, for instance. The Tazara Railway, as it was called, was never a great success, but the Chinese were prepared to put their money where their mouth was, and a very, very expensive effort to try to give a lifeline to Zambia was built through Tanzanian soil. And Nyerere hosted all of this. Despite the failures of Ujamaa, it's worth pointing out its key ingredients. It was a program in which all leaders had to be equal. They couldn't be involved in capitalist or free enterprise activities. They could not own shares in companies. They could not hold directorships in private companies. They could only receive one salary, that was the government salary, and they could not own houses that were rented out to others. This spoke pretty much the kind of puritanical, I almost thought, that emanated from certain quarters of the hard left in Great Britain, and certainly as part of the idealism with which I grew up. Resisted owning rental property to this day, very much as a result of that kind of formation. And this was a formation which I think was common to the left experience, the formative left experience, almost everywhere in the 1950s and into the 1960s. But in terms of a program being applied to everyone, not just the leaders, what you had were the following ingredients of Ujamaa. Firstly, that all human beings are equal. Secondly, that every individual has a right to dignity and respect. Thirdly, that every citizen is an integral part of the nation and has got the right to take an equal part in government at all levels, even if within a one-party state. Fourthly, that every citizen has the right to freedom of expression, of movement, of religious belief, and of association with the context of the law. Again, the political organization could only be conducted within the one-party state. Fifthly, that every individual has the right to receive from society a protection of his life and property held according to law, but if you were a leader, you could only hold so much property. Next, that every individual has the right to receive a just return for his labor, but that meant that nobody could have an unjust return, that is, earn very much more than others. Then, that all citizens together possess all the natural resources of the country together in trust for their descendants. Therefore, communal ownership, which, as I said, caused all kinds of difficulties, when what had been in communal ownership in the older villages, the inhabitants and the owners of that communal history were uprooted to Ujamaa collective villages. Now getting problematic, next, that in order to ensure economic justice, the state must have effective control over the principal means of production. But this meant the state had better get it right in terms of its planning processes, and if it didn't, and it didn't in Tanzania, all kinds of problems before everybody down below. And then finally, it's the responsibility of the state to intervene actively in the economic life of the nation to ensure the equal well-being of all citizens, prevent exploitation of one person by another, to prevent the unjust accumulation of wealth, etc., etc., and to promote a classless society. Well, there were real efforts to do that. As I said, in the times of my visits to help the government in Tanzania, there was a genuine, as it were, condensed space in terms of the range of income. At the top, only 6 times more than at the bottom, and this was unheard of in other parts of Africa, and in fact in most parts of the world. There was a real effort to do that, and the permanent secretary to whom I worked basically said that, yeah, we accept this, or he had to say that to a visitor, but in fact it seemed that he himself was committed to it. So despite all kinds of difficulties, particularly at village level, there was for a long time buy-in until economic conditions became such that the Nyerere experiment simply could not continue, because there was obviously a disjuncture between self-financing of the great experiment in the new state and the new personality that was classless, that was equality, that was willing to give up individual return for the sake of communal return, try to build a new state on the premise of equality and of central planning, so that communal initiative was taken away. So how does the new personality fit in to its communal experience if it cannot express itself in a decisive and an initiative-taking form at that level? So slowly people became disenchanted. The obvious revelations of instances of corruption, leakage, particularly from foreign aid, the need to employ experts from the outside who were on much higher salaries, even if funded from the outside, led to discontent on the part of senior civil servants and other senior figures within who were not receiving such salaries. And of course, the idea of perpetual incumbency. The idea was, as the old man grew older, despite the respect in which he was held, should he continue forever and ever and ever? And underneath the presidency, there were prime ministers. I knew two of the prime ministers, both of them technocrats. Salim, who also held high position in international organizations, like the Organization for African Unity, like the United Nations, was a truly cultured technocrat. And people would see the disjuncture between someone like Salim and someone like Nyerere. Why does this younger man who knows clearly what he's doing, why does he perhaps act as if inhibited by the older man whom we respect, but who may not know as much as Salim knows? So tensions began to creep in at the highest level, sufficient so that Nyerere finally stood down, but remained a very powerful influence behind the throne, as it were. It's only in more recent days that Tanzania, becoming more capitalist, has become therefore more competitive, has therefore began to regain some economic luster at the cost of greater differentiations within society, but still with respect for the legacy and the memory of Nyerere. So a mixed record there, probably one of the great noble experiments. And basically, to complete the troika, we have the case of Kaunda, whom we discussed last week in terms of his formative influences. As I said, a very great deal of influence from Gandhiism, from missionary Christianity. There's only a small Islamic population in Zambia, so that did not have to be a key ingredient in the fusion of influences that Kaunda sought to bring together, and of course his own invention of a communal past, all of which he wrapped up with the term humanism, which again bespoke equality, particularly in the face of the white South, that was both militant in terms of its policies against majority rule countries and militarized in terms of its response against any perceived threat from the majority rule countries. And as I said, that threat was made very, very real in terms of attacks on Zambian soil. Not just Zambian soil, as I said, they reached into Dar es Salaam on occasion, even into Botswana on occasion, and basically no country in the southern part of the continent was safe from first Rhodesian and then white South African depredation. So that the idea of being under siege lent a very great deal of strength to Kaunda's outreach to his people, saying, look, we've got to pull together. If we don't, we're dead. Our only hope is in unity. But along with this unity came a form of central planning, which did not diversify the economy. It is to this day reliant on the mining industry, which meant a bifurcation in terms of class relations, because those who were fortunate enough to have a job in the mining industry, and therefore a regular salary, became a labor aristocracy by comparison to those who depended on jobs that were less secure, those who depended on agricultural income, and those who depended on the vagaries and lacks of guarantee in the informal sector. And with centralized planning, there was very little room for a vibrant informal sector to rise above a certain point. So what you had at a very early stage were the contradictions of this kind of dislocated relationship between the center and the many units of economic production, all under siege from a white South and militarized siege as well, all on top of the constant effort to develop the nation, the state, in the face of the 72 ethnic divisions, which, to Kaunda's huge credit, were basically smoothed over And to this day, they're smoothed over. There's a genuine Zambian national identity, not without its tensions. And of course, a very great effort on his part at developing the educational infrastructure, particularly at the University of Zambia. Now there are many universities, both public and private, many of whom have reached a very good standard. As I said, the external examiners at the early University of Zambia came from SOAS, so I would expect a reasonable standard, and certainly I found that to be the case when I also worked at the University of Zambia. But what it meant was therefore a very strange society of contrasts, militarized on the one hand, but pacific at the same time. So many different disparate groups and different levels of income, but all the same, supposedly united underneath an official communalism. A communalism which said it was traditional, but at the same time was essentially Christian. A form of left-wing Fabianism or social democracy that all the same allowed an alliance with the Soviet side of the great communist bloc. A capacity and a willingness to host liberation movements, but basically choosing out of the Zimbabwean liberation movements that which was closer to Soviet support rather than Robert Mugabe's Chinese-supported side of the liberation movement. Hosting the ANC, the South African liberation movement, certainly. Allowing Thabo Mbeki to operate as a constant visiting presence in Lusaka. Basically allowing the galvanization of resistance to the White South, while at the same time simply putting up with the right response, which could be militarized and wreak havoc upon Lusaka society, certainly, and other parts of Zambian society. And all the same, as I said last week, having the dignity to stand down when he did, and again, this is where you see outside influences. 1989, the Berlin Wall falls. And this is a huge event caught on international cameras. And this excited everybody. I came to lectures one day to give my lecture at the University of Kent to find an empty classroom. And I thought, where the hell is everybody? Empty classroom. The next day, empty classroom. A few days later, they all sheepishly came home and said, Stephen, we couldn't resist. We all piled into cars, vans, anything that we could sequester for the occasion and drove across Europe to Berlin. We wanted to see it. We wanted to swing a sledgehammer as well and help break down the wall. But we've brought you back a piece of the wall. Just hang on there. This is from the Berlin Wall as it went down with some help from University of Kent students in 1989. But what it meant was that this was known around the world, the fall of communism. Or, as it was felt in Zambia, the fall of one-party rule was possible. In other words, the possibility of an alternative had raised its head. So by 1990, entire cities were in revolt against the one-party state of Kenneth Kaunda. So as a response, he was obliged to call elections. He tried to have several months gap so people could organize, he said, and really so his own party could organize and he could organize. But in 1991, as the elections drew closer, it was clear that he knew he was going to lose. As I said, I saw him in Harare 2 weeks before at the Commonwealth Summit there. He was white as a sheet. He knew he was going to lose. And shortly afterwards in Zambia itself, I saw him resign with the utmost dignity. Nothing became him in his life except in his leaving of office as much as anything that went before it. So he's remembered very kindly as well. Is his philosophy of humanism remembered? Well, actually, no. What you've got now is a fully fledged capitalist society, corrupt in many, many ways, still dependent on copper, related mining industries. Christian, but with an increasing impact of the kind of evangelical Christianity that emanates from the United States, where you have, as it were, the idea that God blesses those who get rich. In other words, wealth is a blessing from heaven. So you have even corrupt people professing immense Christianity and excusing the means by which they gain their wealth by saying it's a gift from God for devotion. So all of those kinds of problems married at the same time with Christianity that is charismatic and which does draw from African tradition married with Christian tradition. So that the account in the book of Acts follows the Gospels in the Bible, where the apostles gathered together in hiding, fearful of revenge from the Pharisees after the death of Jesus. They thought they would be a hunted species, were suddenly blessed by flames of fire from heaven, telling them to go forth and to preach the gospel without fear, and they began speaking in tongues. So they were able to preach to people from all nations. This idea of being able to bless, being able to heal, to cure, to speak in tongues is a regular part of the spirit possession rituals of so many churches now in Africa, in Zambia rather, that what you have is a Christianity in a constitutionally Christian nation, which really has fused together parts of Kaunda's hybrid philosophy, Christianity with traditionalism, in a most unexpected way. Does this take government any further forward? Well, no, not really. Can you decolonize this? No, you can't get rid of the Christian influence. It's there now, embedded in its marriage with more traditional forms of worship, of communicating with the other world, the world beyond. The traditional dress of women, the chitenge, the wrap dress, that came with the Victorian missionaries as a mode of modesty. You won't get rid of that now, particularly as it's now printed with beautiful traditional designs. The staple food in Shima, maize meal, a kind of polenta. You can't get rid of that now. Everyone thinks that's the traditional food, but that was brought as a cheap means of crop to feed workers in southern Africa by the white settlers. It's all traditional now. So what you have is a polyglot society which has incorporated everything into a traditionalism. In a way, it's what Kaunda wanted. In a way, it's his success story. He's still alive. He dances. He plays the guitar, a Western instrument. There was no analogous instrument in southern Africa. The kora is something of an analogous instrument in terms of West Africa, not so much in southern Africa. All of this bespeaks a curious means all the same of going forward into a modernity, so that the capacity to modernize and develop is there. Getting the public administrative desire and determination into the planning structures is not yet there. So I'll tell you a little story with which to conclude. Zambia is now going through another one of its great debt cycles. It's in debt to everybody, the Chinese certainly, the IMF certainly, Western hedge fund speculators certainly. Zambia just defaulted on a 3 billion trust fund payment. And so it's actually in the bad books internationally in terms of finance, and it keeps borrowing more and more because there's no other way forward. And so they've got to basically be able to take care of that. And this means a very great deal of devotion to the figure work, which has not always been apparent. So the sign-off story is that one day I get a call from the Minister of Youth in Zambia when I'm living there. Stephen come in, and I come in. The Minister of Youth is a personal friend of mine. He later becomes the Prime Minister underneath President Kaunda. And he says, look, the IMF are coming. And I'm thinking, well, yeah, but surely it's just going to deal with the planning ministries. He said, no, they want to look at the books of every single ministry, even this more minor Ministry of Youth and Sport. I said, okay, what's the problem? And he said, we haven't kept records. They want to look at our data. Um, this is the data we have for the present day. This is the data we presented to them on their last visit, and we haven't kept records in between. And I looked at all this, and I just said to him, his name was Kebby, I said, Kebby, lock me inside here, but not before your people bring me 2 crates of beer. Give me a bottle cap opener and just leave me alone. I'm going to invent some data for you. And so for about 5 hours, while consuming what was called Mosi, the local brand of beer, which is an atrocious beer in my opinion, I invent a plausible continuous data set for them. I think the IMF knew it was invented. I think they were happy that the effort had been put in to the invention, and it was a minor ministry after all. But what this meant was that despite the great philosophical efforts, the great fusion efforts, the great effort to be cosmopolitan, at the end of the day, the new Africa and the new African personality is really only going to emerge on the basis of things that one cannot avoid in this country or any other. You've got to get your planning right. Without that, what you've got is a huge question mark over the legacy and the wonderful philosophical aspirations of all of the African leaders of whom we have spoken today. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for listening.